Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Vanishing Dinnerware of Emperor Elagabalus. When you close your eyes and imagine the ancient Roman Empire, what do you see? Perhaps vast marble temples, senators draped in white togas, or the roar of crowds inside the Colosseum. But the empire was also a place of excessive banquets, gold, and objects, so lavish they almost defied belief. Among these symbols of extravagance were the personal dining sets of the emperors themselves. And none carried a stranger reputation than that of Elagabalus, the short-reigning and scandal-ridden emperor of the 3rd century. His dinnerware, intricately crafted, studded with precious stones, and designed to dazzle, would vanish from history. Centuries later, whispers of its disappearance would echo in museums, auction houses, and scholarly debates. Some said it was destroyed, melted down into coinage. Others, that it was quietly stolen and spirited away into private collections. Tonight, you and I will trace the path of that strange disappearance, beginning not with the theft itself, but with the man whose eccentric tastes gave birth to the objects in the first place. The Emperor of Excess. Elagabalus was never meant to be emperor. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus around 204 CE, he was barely a teenager when the political winds swept him into power. His reign, which lasted from 218 to 222, was brief but notorious. Ancient writers such as Cassius Dio and Herodian painted him as a ruler who indulged in extravagance and ritual, prioritizing personal pleasures and religious novelties over the governance of Rome. His banquets were legendary. Imagine long marble halls filled with torchlight, tables weighed down not by simple bread and olives, but by delicacies drawn from across the empire: peacock tongues, camel heels, rare fish from the Nile. But what caught the attention of chroniclers wasn't just the food, it was the dinnerware. Cups carved from onyx, platters overlaid with gold, bowls encrusted with pearls. He supposedly commissioned entire sets of utensils from solid silver, and there are accounts of him using plates so ornate they were more art than tool. Some historians argue that these reports are exaggerations, fueled by gossip from senators who despised him. But archaeological discoveries of Roman tableware from that period suggest that, while perhaps not as outlandish as described, the emperor's dining sets must have been both real and valuable. And it is here, in the opulence of the early 3rd century, that the story of the missing dinnerware begins. From palaces to the shadows of time. After Elagabalus was assassinated at the age of 18, killed by his own guards in a latrine, if you believe the accounts, his memory was condemned. The Romans practiced damnatio memoriae, the erasure of disgraced leaders. Statues were defaced, inscriptions destroyed, and personal belongings confiscated or lost. For his famed dining treasures, this meant one of two fates. Either they were melted down into coinage to replenish the empire's treasury, or they entered the shadowy world of private ownership. But there's a curious pattern. In inventories of Roman treasure seized by the state after emperors were killed, the lists often mention plate, cups, or jewels. For Elagabalus, there are whispers of inventories that later vanished. A set of scrolls kept in the Capitoline Hill archives supposedly detailed what was seized from him, including banquet vessels of peculiar design. Yet these records disappeared sometime during the Middle Ages. By the time Renaissance collectors began their fevered search for classical treasures, the emperor's notorious dinnerware was nowhere to be found. This absence became, in itself, suspicious. How could objects so famous, if the ancient accounts were to be believed, simply vanish? The market for ancient luxuries. To understand what might have happened, you need to picture Europe between the 15th and 19th centuries. The Renaissance had sparked an obsession with antiquity. Wealthy nobles and scholars scoured ruins, bribed diggers, and purchased artifacts from shadowy dealers. By the 18th century, collecting Roman objects was a mark of prestige. Cabinets of curiosities overflowed with coins, statues, and mosaics, each supposedly tied to a story of empire. In this fervor, the provenance of objects was often ignored. A golden chalice found in a Roman villa could easily be claimed as once belonging to Caesar and sold for a fortune. Could it be that Elagabalus's dinnerware, if it survived the chaos of his death, slipped quietly into this marketplace? That a platter once used at one of his infamous banquets ended up on the table of a Renaissance duke, its origin forgotten, its story erased except in whispers? There are tantalizing hints. In the 1700s, an English antiquarian wrote of a silver dish of unexampled delicacy, supposedly traced back to the Severan dynasty, the very period of Elagabalus. The dish vanished after being sold in a private exchange. In France, a collection of jeweled cups seized during the Revolution was rumored to have once belonged to a decadent Roman sovereign. None of these claims can be proven, but they raise unsettling questions. Were these fleeting glimpses of the lost dinnerware, or mere marketing ploys by dealers eager to inflate prices? Museums, archives, and a trail gone cold. In the modern era, the question of Elagabalus, vanished dinnerware, became a scholarly curiosity. Museum curators sifted through acquisitions, comparing craftsmanship and motifs. A few pieces, such as a large gilded platter in the Louvre and a carved agate bowl in Berlin, were tentatively linked to the Severan period, yet none could be definitively tied to the emperor. The difficulty lies in the nature of Roman artifacts. Thousands of ornate dining pieces survive, scattered across Europe and the Middle East. Without inscriptions or clear provenance, it is almost impossible to attribute them to one man. And because Elagabalus's reign was brief, few official seals or marks would have been applied to his possessions. Still, whispers continue. In private archives, auction records hint at imperial Roman service where changing hands discreetly. Collectors who prize secrecy often shield their purchases from the public eye, especially when legality is questionable. This shadow market of antiquities is where many scholars suspect the true fate of the dinnerware lies. Not destroyed, but hidden, tucked away in private vaults and never displayed. The theft that cannot be traced. Here lies the central paradox. If the dinnerware was confiscated by the Roman state, its disappearance might not have been a theft at all, but rather an erasure, objects melted, transformed, and forgotten. But if instead it slipped away, traded, or stolen during centuries of upheaval, then it becomes one of history's longest-running thefts. A theft so complete that the victims, Rome, its people, its historians, didn't even realize what had been taken until it was far too late. It is not like the robbery of a modern museum, with alarms and newspaper headlines. This was quieter, more insidious. The disappearance of objects across centuries, obscured by wars, fires, sales, and secret trades. By the time modern scholars looked back, there was only a gap in the record, a silence where once there had been splendor. For those who seek resolution, the case of Elagabalus's dinnerware offers little comfort. There are no suspects to interrogate, no fingerprints to dust. Only rumors, fragments, and the uncomfortable possibility that the objects still exist, sitting on the shelves of private collectors who will never admit what they own. By the 19th century, Europe had entered what scholars often call the golden age of archaeology. From the sands of Egypt to the ruins of Pompeii, ancient treasures were being unearthed at a staggering pace. With every excavation, museums and private collectors grew hungrier for relics of Rome. This fervor created not only legitimate discovery, but also rampant theft, forgery, and black market dealings. The name of Elagabalus rarely appeared in the headlines of these digs. He was, after all, a disgraced emperor, his reign a footnote compared to Augustus or Hadrian. But among antiquarians, there lingered a fascination with his eccentricities. His dinnerware, described in ancient texts as bizarre and ostentatious, became a subject of quiet speculation. The question was whispered in salons and auction houses. If it had survived, where would it be now? 1820s. A rumor circulated in Rome about a set of silver goblets unearthed near the Palatine Hill. These goblets, according to reports, bore strange motifs of suns and stars, symbols associated with the Eastern cult Elagabalus had tried to impose on Rome. The goblets, however, vanished from the record shortly after discovery. Some claim they were smuggled to Paris, others that they were melted down discreetly by the finder for profit. Either way, they never reached a museum shelf. A case of provenance and deception. Provenance, the documented history of an object, became both the shield and the Achilles heel of antiquities in the 19th century. Without it, an artifact could be dismissed as just another Roman relic. With it, even the humblest cup could command extraordinary value. For Elagabalus's supposed dinnerware, provenance was always murky. Dealers would hint at connections but rarely produce solid evidence. In 1857, the British Museum received an offer from a private seller for a Roman imperial platter of unique craftsmanship. The seller insisted it had been recovered from a villa once tied to the Severin family. Yet when curators pressed for details, the documentation collapsed. The piece was never purchased, and its whereabouts remain unknown. The deception wasn't always malicious. Sometimes, well-meaning collectors attached romantic stories to their finds. A silver spoon unearthed in Syria was claimed by its owner to have been used in the emperor's banquets simply because it was ornate and of the right period. No evidence supported this, but the tale was repeated in drawing rooms for decades. Each such story added to the fog, making the real history harder to discern. Investigative threads in the 20th century. The 20th century brought more rigorous scholarship. Archaeologists began cataloging artifacts systematically, and museums tightened acquisition standards. It was during this period that the mystery of Elagabalus's missing dinnerware resurfaced in academic circles. In the 1930s, a German scholar named Heinrich Kircher argued that a set of jeweled cups in a private Berlin collection matched the descriptions of Elagabalus's notorious banquets. His reasoning was simple. The designs were excessively ornate, out of step with typical Roman austerity, and they seemed to reflect Eastern influences consistent with the emperor's religious leanings. Yet Kircher's claims could not be tested shortly after. The collection disappeared during World War II. Whether destroyed in bombings or smuggled into hiding, the cups were never seen again. This episode highlighted the fragility of the investigation. Each lead, however promising, seemed to dissolve into the mists of war, theft, or secrecy. Scholars compared the search to chasing shadows across centuries. The shadow market of antiquities. To truly understand why the trail grows cold, you need to step into the underworld of antiquities, the black market, where stolen or looted artifacts are traded in secret. Unlike drug trafficking or weapons smuggling, antiquities crime is often quiet and genteel. A rare platter might be sold not in a dark alley but in a discreet transaction between wealthy collectors. No receipts, no records, just an exchange of wealth for beauty. For centuries, this shadow economy flourished, fueled by the desire to own a piece of history. If Elagabalus's dinnerware did survive, it would be precisely this kind of market where it vanished. A platter too famous to display publicly might still rest in a Swiss vault, its owner satisfied merely to know it exists. A chalice, passed down through a noble family, might sit in a country estate's cupboard, its significance long forgotten. The greatest irony is this: in such cases, the theft is perpetual. The objects are not stolen once, they are stolen forever, removed from public history and locked in silence. A historian's dead end. By the late 20th century, the case of the missing dinnerware had become a curiosity rather than an active pursuit. Historians, faced with scant evidence, treated it as a footnote in the broader story of imperial Rome. A few speculative papers appeared in academic journals, but without new discoveries, interest waned. Yet the mystery lingered in quiet corners. In 1985, an Italian archaeologist named Lucia Conti claimed to have traced references to banquet vessels of peculiar design in a medieval monastery's inventory. The monastery's records suggested the objects had been received as gifts from a noble family in the 15th century, then disappeared during a later fire. Conti's work was met with skepticism. Were the vessels truly imperial, or simply medieval creations mistaken for Roman relics? The debate faded, unresolved. The crime without witnesses. Unlike modern thefts, where investigators can follow a timeline of events, this case unfolds across a canvas of centuries. Each possible theft, whether by a Roman official, a Renaissance collector, or a wartime smuggler, erases the evidence of the one before it. What remains is not a crime scene, but an absence, a silence in the historical record. And yet that absence is itself suspicious. How could objects so notorious simply vanish without leaving a trace? In crime investigation, detectives often say, absence is evidence. Could it be that the very lack of artifacts tied to Elagabalus suggests deliberate destruction? Or is the silence proof of concealment, that someone somewhere still holds the treasures, carefully hidden away? As with many cold cases, the story of Elagabalus's missing dinnerware narrows not to answers, but to theories. Historians, collectors, and archaeologists have put forward three main possibilities. The first, and perhaps most pragmatic, is destruction. In the wake of the emperor's assassination, the Senate had no appetite for preserving his memory. His treasures could have been seized and melted into coinage, their artistry obliterated in favor of state utility. This theory is supported by Roman precedent. Many rulers. Belongings were deliberately destroyed to erase them from history. Yet the flaw is simple. Why then do we hear of inventories, whispers of unusual banquet vessels recorded centuries later? Destruction is tidy. The evidence we have is anything but. The second theory is misattribution. The dinnerware may still exist, scattered across collections but stripped of its story. Without inscriptions or identifying marks, a jeweled goblet from Elagabalus's banquet might sit on display today in a museum, labeled simply as Roman 3rd century. If true, the crime is not theft but historical amnesia. The objects are in plain sight, their identities lost. The third theory is concealment. Here lies the most tantalizing and troubling possibility, that the objects survive intact but hidden in private collections, purchased through the shadow market of antiquities. Perhaps they have passed through centuries of hands, admired in secret, traded discreetly. If this is true, the crime is ongoing not in the theft itself, but in the denial of access, the theft of knowledge from the world at large. Modern investigations. Technology meets mystery. In the 21st century, new tools promise to shed light on ancient mysteries. Techniques such as isotopic analysis, digital imaging, and provenance tracing through auction archives allowed historians to reevaluate artifacts with fresh eyes. Scholars began to look more closely at surviving Roman dining ware from the Severan period, searching for anomalies, unusual craftsmanship, foreign influences, or motifs linked to Elagabalus's Syrian heritage. A few candidates emerged. A set of gold inlaid chalices in a private Italian collection bore designs of the sun, a symbol central to Elagabalus's cult of the god Elagabal. Another platter in the British Museum, long dismissed as excessively ornate, was reevaluated for its peculiar combination of Roman and Syrian iconography. Yet none of these could be definitively linked. Without inscriptions or contemporary references, the trail remained frustratingly thin. Digital sleuths took up the search. Online databases of auction catalogs revealed curious entries for imperial Roman service ware, often with vague or contradictory provenance. A chalice sold in 2009 at a Swiss auction, for instance, was described as possibly tied to the Severan court. After its sale, it vanished into private hands. The secrecy surrounding such sales mirrors the very nature of the crime objects hidden, origins obscured, truths forever withheld. A crime beyond time. When we think of theft, we imagine an act, a break-in, a missing object, a discovery of loss. But here, the theft is smeared across centuries. It is not a single act but an accumulation of vanishings, archives misplaced, collections destroyed, artifacts smuggled. No culprit can be named because the culprits span generations. Officials, collectors, smugglers, even wars themselves. And so, the case transforms into something larger than a missing dinner set. It becomes a symbol of all the lost treasures of antiquity, objects erased not only by human greed, but also by neglect, by accident, by the slow erosion of history. In the silence left behind, we hear the faint echo of all that has been stolen from collective memory. The consequences of silence. Why does this matter? After all, one might argue they were only plates and goblets, utensils of an unpopular emperor. Yet history teaches us that objects carry stories. The dinnerware of Elagabalus, if ever found, could tell us not only about Roman craftsmanship but about cultural exchange, the blending of Eastern and Western motifs, the rituals of banquets, the politics of display. Each missing object is a missing chapter. Moreover, the loss reminds us of the fragility of cultural heritage. Every museum theft, every smuggled artifact, every destroyed record echoes this ancient disappearance. The case of Elagabalus's dinnerware may be unsolved, but it serves as a warning. When history is hidden or erased, it is not only objects that vanish, but understanding itself. The unanswered question. And so, the story closes much as it began, in uncertainty. Was the disappearance of the emperor's infamous dinnerware an intentional act of erasure, carried out by a hostile senate? Was it simple forgetfulness, the objects scattered and mislabeled? Or is there still, somewhere in the world, a locked cabinet containing the gleaming remnants of Rome's strangest ruler, kept from the public eye? The truth may never surface. Yet as you drift with this mystery, consider the weight of silence in history. Sometimes the greatest theft is not of gold or jewels, but of knowledge itself, knowledge that may remain hidden forever. Story 2. The bank robbery with no gun, the 1972 Winnipeg scam. A quiet city, a strange crime. It was the spring of 1972 in Winnipeg, Manitoba. A city defined by its open prairies and biting winters, Winnipeg was not the place one expected headlines of daring bank robberies. Yet that year, a crime unfolded that would puzzle investigators, intrigue criminologists, and leave bank employees shaken, not because they had been threatened at gunpoint, but because the entire robbery happened without a single weapon, without a raised voice, and without even a fingerprint left behind. Most robberies live in the mind as violent affairs. A masked man bursts through the door, weapon drawn, shouts echoing against the marble walls of a bank. This crime was the opposite, polite, calm, executed with the precision of a con artist who understood that psychology can be more powerful than violence. To this day, it is remembered not for what was taken, though the sum was considerable, but for how quietly it was done. The banking world of the 1970s. To understand how such a crime was possible, you need to picture the banking world of the early 1970s. Canada's banks, though reputable, were not fortified in the way modern institutions are. Security cameras were sparse, guards were few, and protocols were simple. Much of a bank's daily operations still relied on personal trust, handwritten notes, and the authority of uniforms or titles. Fraudsters knew this. They understood that if they could impersonate someone in authority, an auditor, a courier, even a government inspector, they could bypass layers of suspicion. It was not always force that opened vaults, but confidence. And confidence, when performed with precision, could be more disarming than a gun. The 1972 Winnipeg case emerged from this world, a world where trust could be weaponized, and where the boldness of deception itself became the crime. Enter the imposter. The man who walked into the downtown Winnipeg branch of the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce in May 1972 did not look like a criminal. He wore a neat suit, carried a briefcase, and introduced himself in a calm, professional voice as a representative from the bank's regional office. The staff, accustomed to occasional audits and courier visits, saw nothing unusual. He explained that he was there to conduct a spot inspection, part of a routine shuffle of branch procedures. His manner was authoritative but not arrogant, precise but not threatening. He carried identification false, of course, but convincing enough for an era when forgery could still pass unnoticed. Within minutes, he had won the trust of the branch manager. And once trust was secured, the rest of the crime unfolded as though scripted. The method. The imposter asked to review records in the manager's office. He examined ledgers, asked routine questions, even made small talk about the weather. Then, with careful timing, he explained that he needed to verify a deposit transfer, one that, according to his forged documents, was scheduled to move from the branch's reserve vault to the central bank office. The branch manager, seeing official paperwork and reassured by the man's calm authority, authorized the withdrawal. Staff brought out the funds, bundles of bills amounting to what would today equal several $100,000. The imposter checked the amounts, signed papers with a flourish, and placed the cash neatly into his briefcase. No threats, no raised voices, only procedure, trust, and deception. Then, as quietly as he had entered, the imposter left the building, briefcase in hand. The discovery. It wasn't until hours later that suspicion arose. A phone call from the bank's regional office asked about the supposed transfer. Confusion spread quickly. There had been no scheduled audit, no transfer was due, and no employee had been dispatched to collect funds. By the time the truth became clear, the man was long gone, his identity unknown, his briefcase full of the bank's money, his method brilliant in its simplicity. Police were called, statements taken, descriptions gathered, but the staff could only repeat what they had seen. A polite man in a suit, confident, professional, carrying all the authority of a legitimate inspector. There had been no violence, no resistance, not even panic, only the eerie realization that they had willingly handed over the money. The power of confidence. What makes this crime remarkable is not only its success but its psychology. The imposter understood something fundamental. People are conditioned to obey authority, especially when it is presented calmly and confidently. By wearing the right suit, carrying the right paperwork, and speaking in the right tone, he bypassed suspicion. It is the same principle behind confidence tricks throughout history, from fake police officers to fraudulent couriers. Yet the Winnipeg scam stands out because it targeted not individuals, but an entire bank. The audacity was breathtaking. And so, investigators found themselves with a crime scene that wasn't really a crime scene at all. No forced doors, no broken locks, no weapons recovered. Just a briefcase that had walked out the front door, carried by a man who looked like he belonged there. The first hours of panic. When the truth dawned on the Winnipeg branch employees, their reactions were tinged with disbelief. How could this have happened in broad daylight, with no alarms raised and no violence committed? Yet as investigators began their work, the reality sank in. The money was gone, and so was the man who had taken it. The branch manager provided the first detailed account. He described the imposter as middle-aged, well-dressed, with neatly combed dark hair and an air of calm confidence. Other employees echoed the description but admitted that they had barely looked twice at the man. He had seemed so ordinary, so official, that none of them had thought to question him. Police quickly realized they were dealing with more than a simple theft. This was a confidence trick carried out with precision, and if a man could impersonate authority so convincingly, he could also vanish just as convincingly. The investigation begins. Detectives from the Winnipeg Police Department canvassed the area around the bank. Witnesses recalled a man leaving the branch around midday with a briefcase, but no one had noticed a getaway car. No cab drivers reported picking him up. No buses were known to have carried a passenger matching the description. It was as if the imposter had stepped out of the bank and melted into the streets. Fingerprints inside the manager's office were dusted, but all belonged to staff. The paperwork the man had produced, a forged set of transfer orders, was left behind. It was professional in appearance, but, upon inspection, filled with subtle inconsistencies. Investigators believed the documents had been prepared in advance by someone who understood the internal procedures of the bank. This suggested something chilling. The imposter had inside knowledge. Suspects and theories. The possibility of an inside accomplice quickly became central to the investigation. How else could the imposter have known the precise forms, the right jargon, the appearance of authentic documentation? Police interviewed employees and examined their connections. Was it possible that one of them had tipped off the robber, or worse, directly collaborated? Yet no evidence emerged. Staff backgrounds were checked, but none showed suspicious ties. Loyalty to the bank seemed genuine. If there was an inside connection, it was buried deep. Another theory focused on professional con artists. Across North America in the 1960s and 70s, a wave of high-level fraudsters used impersonation schemes to steal money from corporations and institutions. Winnipeg's case fit this pattern perfectly. A single, audacious hit executed with finesse. Perhaps the imposter was part of a traveling circuit of swindlers, moving from city to city, each scam tailored to exploit local weaknesses. Media and public reaction. When news of the scam reached the public, headlines fixated on its strangeness. "Bank robbed without gun," one paper declared. Another called it the polite robbery. For a city accustomed to more straightforward crime, the event was both unsettling and oddly fascinating. Citizens found themselves reflecting on their own vulnerabilities. If a man could simply walk into a bank and carry away money without force, what other institutions could be tricked? Trust in authority, the very glue of social order, felt suddenly fragile. The police, meanwhile, faced pressure. Bank robberies, even violent ones, were crimes the public understood. This, however, was different. It was embarrassing not just for the bank, but for the systems of trust on which business depended. The trail of disappearance. Detectives traced the forgery. The paper stock used for the fake transfer documents was common, available in office supply stores across the region. The typeface suggested an ordinary typewriter. No unique clues emerged. Airports were checked for passengers matching the imposter's description, but nothing surfaced. Train stations offered no leads. Border crossings were monitored, but with the lack of photographic evidence, the search was blind. Weeks passed, then months. Leads dried up. The imposter had vanished with the same calm precision with which he had entered the bank. The bank's response. For the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, the robbery was more than a financial loss, it was a reputational wound. Quietly, they tightened internal procedures. New verification methods for audits and transfers were introduced. Staff were trained to question even the most official-looking visitors. Security cameras became more common in branches across the country. Though the changes were not widely publicized, they reflected a growing awareness. In an era of trust-based banking, the human element was the weak link. The imposter had exploited not a vault, but the psychology of obedience. The broader pattern. Criminologists looking back on the 1972 Winnipeg case now see it as part of a larger shift in crime. The 20th century witnessed a move away from purely physical theft, guns, break-ins, safes cracked by force, toward crimes of deception. White-collar criminals, fraudsters, and con artists recognized that human trust could be manipulated more easily than locks could be broken. The Winnipeg scam became a textbook example of what some called social engineering crime, the art of using authority, trust, and presentation to bypass barriers. Decades later, cybercriminals would use the same principles in phishing schemes and digital frauds. The imposter in 1972 was, in many ways, ahead of his time. The cold case. By the winter of 1972, police files on the Winnipeg bank scam had thinned. Leads had been exhausted, suspects eliminated, and the trail had gone cold. Despite the embarrassment, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce never disclosed the exact amount stolen. Reports suggest it was equivalent to several $100,000 today, but insiders confirmed it was enough to sting. For investigators, the robbery represented the worst kind of failure. No arrests, no suspects, no recovery. A crime without fingerprints, without weapons, without confrontation, and without closure. The imposter had simply walked out of history. A criminal profile. Criminologists later pieced together a profile of the likely perpetrator. He was not a traditional robber, but a con artist with extraordinary preparation and nerves of steel. His knowledge of banking procedures suggested either prior experience in the industry or close contact with someone who had such knowledge. His demeanor reflected hours of rehearsal, a mastery of social cues, and a confidence that few could fake under pressure. In short, he was a professional, someone who understood that crime is as much performance as it is theft. And perhaps most chilling, he may have struck again elsewhere, under another name, in another city, leaving behind only silence and speculation. Ripples of chain. Though the case was never solved, its impact was lasting. Banks across Canada quietly reviewed their security practices. No longer could a well-dressed stranger with paperwork be trusted without verification. Identification standards became stricter, multi-step authorizations for transfers were implemented, and staff were trained to question authority when something felt wrong. It was an early acknowledgement of what would later become standard in fraud prevention. The recognition that trust, while essential to business, must always be tested. The public fascination. The story lingered in Winnipeg folklore. Locals repeated it with a mixture of admiration and unease. Admiration for the brilliance of the scheme, unease at how easily trust had been manipulated. Newspapers revisited it occasionally, especially when new frauds surfaced, framing the 1972 scam as a cautionary tale. For ordinary people, the crime was strangely comforting. No one had been hurt. No guns were waved, no shots fired. Yet the very bloodlessness of the robbery made it all the more unsettling. If such a theft could happen without violence, what other deceptions could pass unnoticed in daily life? Echoes in modern crime. Looking back, the Winnipeg scam feels almost prophetic. In today's world, cybercriminals often use the same principles: impersonating authority, fabricating documents, and persuading victims to hand over money willingly. Instead of walking into a bank in a suit, a modern imposter sends an email posing as a company executive, directing a transfer. The psychology is identical. The medium has simply changed. Security experts now describe such crimes as social engineering. They are not attacks on buildings or safes, but attacks on people, their instincts, their habits of trust, their reliance on authority. And in that sense, the Winnipeg imposter stands as an early master of the craft. The unanswered question. Despite all the theories, one mystery endures. What became of the man himself? Did he live out his days comfortably, his fortune hidden away? Did he move on to other scams, leaving a trail too faint to follow? Or was he caught years later under another name, his Winnipeg heist forgotten among a string of deceptions? No records confirm his fate. His name, his life, his ending, these remain unknown. All that survives is the story of a man who robbed a bank without ever brandishing a weapon, proving that sometimes the sharpest tool in crime is not a gun, but confidence. Story 3. The Missing Doctor of Springfield. The ordinary town, the extraordinary disappearance. Springfield. It is a name shared by dozens of towns across North America, a byword for the everyday. And yet, in one such Springfield in the mid-20th century, a crime unfolded that would disturb the peace of a tight-knit community and leave questions echoing for decades. A local doctor, a man trusted by all, vanished without explanation. No ransom, no threats, no clear enemies. One day he was there, tending to coughs and broken bones. The next he was gone. Disappearance is a peculiar crime. It leaves behind not a broken window or a ransacked safe, but an absence, a silence where once there was life. And for Springfield, the absence of their doctor was more than a mystery, it was a wound. The doctor's life. Dr. Charles Whitman, though some records spell his surname slightly differently, had been a fixture in Springfield for over 20 years. Born in the early 1900s, he studied medicine in Chicago before returning to practice in a quieter town. By the 1940s, he was known not only as a physician but as a community man. Present at church picnics, the sponsor of a local baseball team, the kind of neighbor who never locked his door. He lived in a modest two-story home on Maple Street. Patients often recalled how his waiting room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and how he kept a small library of medical texts alongside well-worn detective novels. He was not wealthy, but he was comfortable. His life seemed settled, steady, and transparent. And that is precisely why his sudden disappearance in 1959 shocked everyone who knew him. The day he vanished. It was a Tuesday in late autumn when Dr. Whitman was last seen. He had finished his rounds in the morning, stopping to check on several elderly patients. In the afternoon, he returned to his office, wrote a few prescriptions, and told his nurse he would be heading out early. He left just before 4 p.m., carrying his leather doctor's bag, wearing a gray overcoat against the chill. He never came home. When evening fell and he did not return, his housekeeper grew concerned. She called a neighbor who checked the home. The lights were off, the bed unslept in. His car was still in the driveway, and his beloved dog, normally walked at dusk, was restless and unfed. By morning, the alarm had spread. The town doctor was missing. The first search. Police organized a search quickly, though at first there was little sense of urgency. Perhaps he had gone to a medical conference. Perhaps he had fallen ill and checked himself into a hospital, but calls to nearby cities turned up nothing. No hospitals reported his arrival. No colleagues expected him. The search widened. Local men combed the woods outside town. Officers checked the riverbanks. Farmers were asked to inspect their barns. Still, no sign of him. His office records showed nothing unusual. No large withdrawals from his bank account. No strange notes or sudden bills. His life, as far as investigators could tell, was unremarkable, and yet he had vanished as though erased. Suspicions and whispers. With no clear leads, the town began to whisper. Was it foul play? Had he crossed the wrong person? Though Springfield was small, it was not immune to human conflict. Some recalled disputes over unpaid medical bills. Others hinted at patients dissatisfied with his treatments. Rumors of affairs soon emerged. A man of his age and status, unmarried, living alone, perhaps he had been seeing someone quietly. If so, was there a scandal beneath the surface? Had jealousy or secrecy led to his disappearance? Police investigated discreetly but found nothing concrete. No lovers came forward, no hidden debts appeared. And so suspicion drifted outward. Had he been targeted by outsiders? A robbery gone wrong? A traveler passing through town with darker intentions? A doctor's bag in the dark. The first physical clue appeared nearly a week later. A farmer discovered a leather doctor's bag abandoned at the edge of a wooded road miles outside town. Inside were Whitman's medical tools, a stethoscope, and prescription pads. Nothing was missing, but the presence of the bag there raised questions. Had he dropped it while fleeing someone? Had it been planted? Or had someone carried it there to confuse the search? For police, the discovery only deepened the mystery. There were no footprints nearby, no tire tracks clear enough to follow. The bag, like the disappearance itself, seemed to exist in a void. The trail goes cold. As weeks turned into months, hope dimmed. Winter set in, the river froze, and the community carried on without its doctor. Another physician eventually filled the role, but the absence remained sharp. Families remembered how he had delivered their children, how he had sat by sickbeds late into the night. To lose him without explanation felt personal. The case never officially closed, but it grew colder with each passing year. Occasionally, a sighting would be reported, a man fitting his description seen in St. Louis, another in Minneapolis, but none were ever confirmed. The doctor seemed to have dissolved into the ether. The community's uneasy watch. By the first month after Dr. Whitman's disappearance, Springfield had shifted from shock to unease. His absence was not only a personal loss but also a disruption of trust. The doctor had been a cornerstone figure. Neighbors knew his routines, patients relied on his presence, and even the shopkeepers expected his familiar nod on Main Street. Without him, Springfield felt less certain of itself. Some residents organized informal watches, believing he might return at any moment. Porch lights were left burning, curtains twitched with expectation. Yet each night ended the same: silence. The town was learning an uncomfortable lesson that disappearance leaves no closure, only questions that fester. Police pursue leads. The Springfield police, with support from the State Bureau, pressed on with their investigation. Their first task was to reconstruct Whitman's final day in minute detail. They spoke to every patient he had seen that Tuesday. All reported ordinary visits, blood pressure checks, colds, minor aches. None recalled anything unusual. His nurse described him as calm but slightly distracted. He wasn't himself, she later said, though she couldn't explain why. He had left earlier than usual, something he rarely did. She remembered clearly. He carried his doctor's bag and wore his gray overcoat. Police traced his steps as far as they could, but beyond his office door, the trail ended. No one saw him on the walk home. No one remembered him stopping at the grocer or at the diner he sometimes visited. His world, so predictable for 20 years, had simply closed in on itself. The doctor's bag is a clue. The discovery of Whitman's leather bag outside town remained the only physical evidence. Detectives examined it carefully. The tools were intact, the prescription pads untouched. No blood, no fingerprints beyond his own. To some, it looked staged, as if someone had wanted the bag to be found. But why? To suggest foul play? To throw police off the trail? Or was it Whitman himself, discarding a symbol of his profession before walking away from his old life? The bag became both clue and riddle, and in the absence of other evidence, it drew speculation like a magnet. Rumors of secrets. As the months wore on, the gossip grew louder. Some claimed Whitman had been involved in secret experiments, that he had crossed paths with medical authorities in the city. Others insisted he was being blackmailed, though no letters or demands were ever found. The most persistent rumor was that of a hidden relationship. A man of his age, unmarried, was already a subject of speculation in small-town life. Had he been seeing someone in secret? And if so, had that relationship soured, leading to violence? Investigators looked into several women he had been seen with casually at church events and social gatherings. None admitted to more than acquaintance. No one in town, it seemed, knew him as intimately as they had believed. For a man so visible in the community, he was strangely private. The escape theory. Another line of investigation considered the possibility of voluntary disappearance. Could Whitman have simply chosen to walk away? His finances were stable, his house modest, but he had no close family ties. No wife, no children. To some, it was not unthinkable that he had slipped away to start fresh elsewhere. Yet skeptics pointed to the suddenness. If he had planned an escape, why leave his car in the driveway, his dog unfed, his home untouched? Why abandon without so much as a letter? And where would he have gone? His medical license would have required reapplication elsewhere. His face was known in professional circles. Reinvention, while not impossible, would have been exceedingly difficult. Possible violence. As weeks passed with no sightings, darker theories gained ground. Perhaps he had been abducted, attacked while walking home. The wooded roads outside Springfield were quiet, often empty at dusk. A robbery gone wrong could explain his disappearance, but not the absence of evidence. No struggle, no blood, no stolen possessions. If violence had occurred, it was unnervingly clean, too clean for investigators' comfort. Investigative dead ends. Leads dwindled. A drifter arrested in another town claimed to have seen the doctor, but his story unraveled under questioning. A body found along the river months later sparked brief hope of resolution, but it proved to be unrelated. Every promising avenue collapsed into nothing. The detectives found themselves circling the same questions. Did he leave willingly? Did someone silence him? Or was it an accident hidden too well by circumstance? The void remained, wide and unmoving. The shadow on Springfield. For Springfield, the investigation's failure became a quiet scar. Parents warned children to stay close to home, as if Whitman's disappearance proved that anyone could vanish. Patients adjusted uneasily to new doctors, always comparing them to the one who was gone. The church bell still rang on Sundays, shops still opened each morning, but beneath the rhythms of life lay a sense of fracture. The doctor who had once represented stability had disappeared, and with him went the illusion of certainty. The investigation winds down. By the early 1960s, active searches for Dr. Charles Whitman had faded. Police reports thinned into annual reviews, then to occasional notations when new tips surfaced. The case was never officially closed, but it lived in a category familiar to investigators: unresolved, unsolved, and unlikely to yield new answers. Decades later, the yellowing files revealed the frustration of those who had tried to solve it. Every interview, every clue, every dead end had been recorded, but none led to a resolution. Detectives who had once pored over maps and schedules retired. Their successors, inheriting the cold case, found nothing fresh to pursue. For law enforcement, the disappearance was an enduring reminder that not all mysteries yield to persistence. Springfield learns to live with the absence. As years turned into decades, Springfield adjusted to life without its doctor. A new physician established practice, children grew up, families moved on. Yet the story of Dr. Whitman's disappearance lingered in conversations, told in whispers at the diner or in hushed tones at church socials. The doctor's house was eventually sold, his belongings distributed or discarded. But his absence was harder to erase. For those who had once relied on his calm presence during illnesses and emergencies, the missing figure remained palpable. The town developed a collective memory, shaped less by what was known and more by the void itself. Parents told children not to walk alone after dark, even years later. His disappearance became a warning, a symbol of uncertainty beneath the fabric of ordinary life. Theories that wouldn't die. Several theories continued to circulate, gaining almost folkloric status. The secret life. Some insisted Whitman had maintained a double life, perhaps in another city. His sudden departure, they argued, was not an abduction but an escape. Supporters of this theory pointed to his solitary nature, his lack of close family ties. Skeptics countered. Why leave everything behind so abruptly, so messily? The silenced witness. Another theory claimed he had stumbled upon something he should not have seen: illegal activity, corruption, perhaps even organized crime moving quietly through the region. If true, his disappearance was not voluntary but enforced. Yet no evidence of such connections ever surfaced. The lost traveler. Some clung to the idea of accident. Perhaps he had wandered into the woods, fallen ill or injured, and his body had never been found. The countryside was vast, the rivers unpredictable. A single misstep could have erased him without malice. None of these theories carried proof. Each was both plausible and insufficient, a reminder that speculation thrives where facts wither. The bag reconsidered. In later years, criminologists returned to the detail of the abandoned doctor's bag. To some, it symbolized foul play, a body removed. a clue discarded to mislead. To others, it symbolized choice, the deliberate casting away of a professional identity before walking into a new life. The bag, ordinary and intimate, remained the most haunting artifact of the case. Without it, Whitman might have seemed to vanish into thin air. With it, he seemed to leave behind a riddle. Modern eyes on an old mystery. By the 1990s, the case of Dr. Whitman had been re-examined by amateur sleuths and historians. Some filed requests for forgotten records, hoping to find overlooked details. Others scoured genealogical databases for sightings under new names. The rise of digital tools promised breakthroughs, but none came. In truth, too much time had passed. Witnesses were gone, evidence degraded, and whatever answers might once have existed were buried under decades of silence. The case endures in archives not because of breakthroughs, but because of its resonance. A trusted doctor, a visible man, disappearing without a trace, such a story resists fading. The broader meaning. What does a case like this leave behind? For Springfield, it was a reminder that even the most ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary mysteries. For criminologists, it was a case study in the limits of investigation, how absence rather than presence can define a crime. And for all who hear it, the disappearance of Dr. Charles Whitman prompts reflection on the fragility of certainty. We believe we know our neighbors, our routines, our communities. But when one piece is removed suddenly, without explanation, the whole fabric feels less secure. Story 4. The quiet fraud of William Hightower post office scandals in 1915. A nation in transition. The year was 1915. North America was a continent in flux, cities swelling with industry, rural towns still tied to old rhythms, and the postal service serving as the artery that connected them all. Before the telephone was common and long before the internet, the post office was not just a place to send letters but a lifeline of commerce, trust, and personal connection. People ordered goods by mail, conducted business by correspondence, and trusted the postal system with money orders and payments. If you mailed a letter, you expected it to arrive. If you sent money, you believed it would be safe. To doubt the post office was to doubt the very fabric of society's communication. And into this world stepped William Hightower, a quiet, unremarkable man, whose name would become tied to one of the most curious postal fraud cases of the early 20th century. Who was William Hightower? Hightower was not a notorious criminal. Born in the Midwest in the late 19th century, he had worked various clerical jobs before securing employment with the post office. By all accounts, he was polite, punctual, and easily overlooked. He was not the type of man to draw suspicion. And yet, it was precisely his ordinariness that allowed him to exploit the system. Unlike flamboyant con men of the era, Hightower was methodical. His fraud would not involve flashy scams or violent robberies. Instead, it would consist of quiet manipulations, tiny cuts into the trust that ordinary citizens placed in the mail. His weapon was not a gun, but paper. The opportunity. At the time, one of the most vulnerable parts of the postal system was the money order. Citizens used these as secure ways to send payment through the mail. For a small fee, one could purchase a money order from the post office, payable to a recipient in another city. It was safer than sending cash, and widely used for everything from magazine subscriptions to catalog purchases. But the system was far from foolproof. Records were handwritten, checks were irregular, and oversight was limited, especially in smaller towns. A dishonest employee could, with the right knowledge, exploit the process. And Hightower had both the knowledge and the access. The scheme unfolds. At first, his actions were subtle. Investigators later pieced together that Hightower began by manipulating the money order books. He would issue a money order to himself under a false name, then alter the records to conceal the discrepancy. The sums were small, $5 here, $10 there, amounts unlikely to trigger scrutiny. But over time, the fraud grew bolder. He created fictitious recipients, forged signatures, and even intercepted outgoing money orders, altering them to his own benefit. In some cases, he redirected orders intended for catalog companies, pocketing the funds while leaving customers to wonder why their goods never arrived. For months, perhaps even years, the scheme went unnoticed. The post office was vast, and in an era without centralized databases, discrepancies often disappeared into the fog of bureaucracy. The cracks began to show. The first signs of trouble appeared in 1915, when complaints began to trickle in. A farmer reported that his payment for farm equipment had vanished. A widow claimed her subscription money for a mail-order magazine never reached its destination. At first, these were dismissed as isolated errors, mistakes of record-keeping or delivery. But as the complaints multiplied, patterns emerged. Many originated from the same Springfield area post office where Hightower worked. And more troubling still, the missing funds seemed tied to money orders processed during his shifts. It was then that federal inspectors, the feared postal inspectors, among the earliest professional investigators in the United States, turned their attention to the quiet clerk. The power of the postal inspectors. Few citizens of 1915 realized how formidable the Postal Inspection Service could be. Established in the 19th century, it was among the first federal law enforcement agencies, tasked with protecting the integrity of the mail. Inspectors carried badges, conducted undercover work, and pursued fraudsters with relentless focus. To steal from the mail was not just a crime against individuals, it was a crime against the government itself. And in an era where trust in the postal system underpinned daily life, such theft was treated with particular severity. For William Hightower, the attention of the inspectors meant the beginning of the end. The trap tightens. Investigators quietly began auditing the money order records. They compared receipts to ledgers, cross-referenced signatures, and traced supposed recipients. Again and again, the threads led back to Hightower. The handwriting matched, the timings aligned, and the false names appeared connected. Still, evidence was circumstantial. To convict, inspectors needed proof, something that tied Hightower directly to the missing funds. They set a trap. Postal inspectors planted a controlled money order through his office, carefully marked and monitored. Within days, it vanished into the same shadow that had consumed the others. When investigators followed the trail, they found the order had been altered and cashed by none other than Hightower, operating under an alias. The quiet fraud had been exposed. The arrest. It was late summer of 1915 when William Hightower's quiet world collapsed. Postal inspectors, having laid their trap with the planted money order, confronted him in his Springfield office. The man who had for years been considered a model clerk looked up from his desk with the same mild expression he had always worn. According to later testimony, Hightower did not protest loudly or attempt to flee. Instead, he offered a brief, almost weary denial before falling silent as inspectors presented the evidence. His office was searched, his handwriting samples taken, his personal papers seized. In the corner of his small rented room, inspectors found receipts and scraps of forged names, crumpled but damning. Neighbors were stunned. The Hightower they knew was punctual, polite, even forgettable. The idea that he had been quietly siphoning money through fraud left them unsettled. It was not the crime itself, though serious, that shocked them most. It was that it had been committed by someone so ordinary, so invisible. The investigation expands. With Hightower in custody, inspectors widened their scope. They combed through years of money order ledgers, tracing every irregularity, every questionable transaction. The numbers added up to a significant sum. By some estimates, he had diverted the equivalent of tens of thousands of modern dollars. The method, though clever, now seemed obvious. Hightower had relied not on brilliance, but on the sheer scale of the postal system. In an institution processing millions of transactions, small manipulations could vanish unnoticed. He had bet that oversight would be too thin to catch him, and for years, he had been right. His undoing came not from greed for vast amounts, but from repetition. The same patterns, the same handwriting, the same small errors repeated often enough for inspectors to see the shape of the fraud. The trial. The case moved quickly to federal court, as mail fraud was considered a crime against the United States government itself. The courtroom, though small, filled with curious townspeople eager to glimpse the man whose quiet duplicity had shaken their trust. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision. They presented altered ledgers, forged names, and intercepted money orders. Expert witnesses compared handwriting samples. Bank clerks testified about cashing orders for aliases that inspectors linked to Hightower. The defense, limited in its options, suggested he had been framed or that clerical errors explained the discrepancies. But the planted money order proved decisive. It had been introduced under controlled circumstances, carefully tracked, and its disappearance traced directly to him. The jury needed little convincing. After only a few hours of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict. The sentence. Hightower was sentenced to several years in federal prison. In 1915, such a sentence carried both punishment and stigma. Fraud against the postal system was treated with particular gravity, as it represented an attack on one of the most trusted institutions in American life. For the people of Springfield, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but also unease. If someone like Hightower could quietly exploit the system for years, what did that say about the vulnerabilities of institutions built on trust? The impact on the Postal Service. In the aftermath, the Post Office Department tightened oversight. Money order procedures were revised, audits became more frequent, and inspectors were granted broader powers to investigate irregularities. Training for clerks emphasized vigilance, and new record-keeping methods reduced opportunities for manipulation. The case became a minor but memorable example in the annals of postal crime, less famous than train robberies or stagecoach heists, but influential in shaping how the postal system modernized. The man behind the fraud. Despite the trial's resolution, questions lingered about Hightower himself. Why had he done it? The sums were never extravagant, just steady siphoning, enough to live a little more comfortably perhaps, but not enough to fund a lavish life. Some suggested desperation, debts, quiet obligations, or hidden vices. Others believed it was opportunity, the thrill of testing whether he could beat the system. In prison interviews, he spoke little, offering neither confession nor explanation. His silence became part of the mystery. Life behind bars. William Hightower entered federal prison in late 1915, leaving behind the orderly world of Springfield's post office for the rigid routine of incarceration. Records from the penitentiary describe him as a compliant inmate, quiet, punctual, and rarely causing trouble. In many ways, he seemed the same as he had in Springfield, ordinary, almost invisible. But his fellow inmates saw something else. Some described him as withdrawn, carrying himself with a mixture of shame and defiance. Unlike thieves or violent offenders, whose reputations could carry a strange sort of respect inside prison walls, Hightower was viewed as an oddity, a man who had stolen not with force, but with paper. He served out his sentence with little incident. When he was released, he faded quickly into obscurity, moving away from Springfield and leaving behind no further trace in newspaper archives. For a man who had once manipulated records with precision, disappearing into the quiet margins of history seemed almost fitting. Springfield moves on. Back in Springfield, the scandal lingered for years in memory. Residents remembered how shocked they had been, how ordinary the man seemed who had siphoned away their money orders. The trust that had been broken did not easily return. Customers watched clerks more closely. Conversations in line at the post office were sharper, more suspicious. Though new employees eventually replaced him, Heitwer's shadow lingered over the branch. His name became shorthand in Springfield for dishonesty hidden in plain sight. Children heard their parents mutter, "Don't be a Heitwer," when warning against cutting corners or cheating. Lessons for the Postal Service. For the United States Postal Service, the Heitwer affair, while small in scale compared to other frauds, proved a valuable lesson. Inspectors used the case in training materials for years, citing it as an example of how even minor clerks could undermine trust if oversight was weak. The reforms introduced after his arrest grew stronger in the decades that followed. By the 1920s and 30s, money orders were redesigned with better tracking systems, fraud detection procedures became more sophisticated, and audits became stricter. The case highlighted a simple truth: institutions that handle trust must always assume trust can be exploited. The broader context. Heitwer's fraud was not unique in its time. The early 20th century saw dozens of similar cases: postal workers intercepting letters, manipulating money orders, or pocketing cash. What made his case unusual was how long it went undetected, and how completely he embodied the ordinariness of bureaucratic life. In an age before cybercrime and digital fraud, his method seems almost quaint. Yet the principle is timeless. Systems that depend on paperwork, signatures, and routine are vulnerable not to outsiders breaking in, but to insiders quietly bending the rules. In this sense, Heitwer's story anticipates the dilemmas of modern institutions facing insider fraud, embezzlement, and corruption. The tools have changed, but the psychology remains the same. Reflection on motive. To this day, Heitwer's precise motive is unclear. He was not flamboyant, not visibly greedy, and not reckless. Some suggested he had debts, perhaps gambling or personal obligations he never admitted. Others believed it was the temptation of opportunity itself, the knowledge that he could take, and that no one seemed to notice. Perhaps the answer lies in something quieter still, a slow erosion of conscience, each small act making the next easier. Fraud often begins not with grand plans but with small rationalizations. A few dollars borrowed, an entry altered just this once. Over time, the small acts accumulate into something much larger. Heitwer may never have seen himself as a criminal, only as a man taking advantage of a system too vast to notice him. Until, of course, it did. Story 5. The curious disappearance of the library's rare map collection. The hidden treasures of libraries. When you think of theft, you probably picture jewels, cash, or art heists, dramatic crimes with glittering rewards. Rarely do people imagine libraries as crime scenes. And yet, some of the most valuable objects ever stolen are not diamonds but paper, manuscripts, books, and maps. Maps in particular occupy a strange place in the world of collecting. To most of us, they are tools folded into glove compartments, pinned on walls. But in centuries past, maps were symbols of power and knowledge. They charted discoveries, claimed territories, and displayed the ambitions of empires. A single Renaissance-era map, hand-drawn and colored, can fetch tens of thousands of dollars at auction. This was the world that drew quiet thieves into the stacks of a Springfield-area university library in the 1980s, where a collection of rare maps some centuries old suddenly began to disappear. The library and its collection. The university's library was not grand, but it had been growing steadily since the 19th century. Alongside textbooks and journals, it housed a special collection of rare works donated by alumni and collectors. Among these were maps, atlases from the 16th century, nautical charts from the Age of Exploration, and early maps of North America printed before the Revolution. They were kept in cabinets, available to scholars who requested them under supervision. But unlike a high-security museum, the library's rare book room relied largely on trust. A librarian would fetch the requested item, place it on a table, and leave the researcher to work, occasionally checking in. Cameras were few, guards non-existent. After all, who would think to steal a map? The first signs of disappearance. The first missing map wasn't noticed right away. A graduate student had requested a 17th-century Dutch atlas, only for the librarian to discover one of its engraved charts missing. It had been neatly excised with a blade, the edges clean. The librarian, embarrassed, assumed it had been damaged or misplaced years earlier. No report was filed. But then another map was found missing, this time from a different volume. Soon, the pattern was undeniable. Pages were being removed, one by one, from valuable atlases and rare books. It was not careless damage. It was deliberate theft. The library staff realized, with growing horror, that someone had been cutting maps from their collection under their very noses. The modus operandi. Investigators later pieced together how the thefts had been carried out. The thief, posing as a researcher, would request rare volumes, usually atlases. Once seated, they would quietly use a razor blade or scalpel to slice out individual maps. The excision took minutes. The thief would then close the book, return it, and leave. Because the maps were thin sheets of paper, they could be easily hidden in folders, briefcases, or even inside clothing. Unless a librarian checked every page upon return, the theft went unnoticed. And often, librarians did not check. Trust was the foundation of the reading room. By the time the missing items were cataloged, weeks or months might have passed, the thief long gone. The market for maps. To understand why anyone would risk such a theft, you need to consider the booming market for antique maps in the 1980s. Collectors, especially in Europe and the United States, were willing to pay high sums for early cartography. The appeal was both aesthetic and symbolic. Maps were framed as art, hung in boardrooms and studies, testaments to history and exploration. Dealers often asked few questions about provenance. A single sheet, cut from an old atlas, might fetch hundreds or even thousands of dollars. A thief who knew the market could profit handsomely by selling maps piecemeal, scattering them through different dealers so no one saw the full picture. The Springfield case was not an isolated one. Libraries across the country were reporting similar thefts, maps disappearing, atlases mutilated. It seemed to be part of a larger trend, a wave of cultural thefts exploiting the quiet vulnerability of libraries. Investigators step in. When the scale of the thefts became clear, the library called in law enforcement. Federal investigators specializing in cultural property began reviewing records, interviewing staff, and compiling lists of missing maps. They compared these with auction catalogs and dealer inventories, looking for matches. But the investigation faced obstacles. Maps, once removed, were difficult to trace. Many lacked unique identifiers. Dealers often listed them vaguely, 17th-century Dutch map of the Americas, without noting origin. And buyers, thrilled to acquire a piece of history, rarely asked where it had come from. The thief had chosen his target well. Objects valuable enough to sell, but untraceable enough to vanish into the market. A community betrayed. For scholars, the loss was devastating. Rare maps are more than decoration, they are historical documents, offering insights into how the world was once seen. Every missing sheet represented a hole in the record, a piece of history severed from its context. Professors mourned the mutilated volumes. Students were told certain works could no longer be used. The library, once a place of openness, grew cautious and restrictive. What had been stolen was not only paper but trust. The first break. By the late 1980s, reports of missing maps were no longer isolated. Libraries across North America and Europe began to notice the same pattern. Rare atlases mutilated, single sheets excised with surgical precision. The Springfield University's case, once dismissed as an unfortunate accident, was now recognized as part of a larger wave. The first real break came when a stolen map surfaced in an auction catalog in New York. A sharp-eyed scholar recognized it as nearly identical to one missing from Springfield's collection. The coloration, the plate marks, even the faint marginalia matched. Investigators realized that the thief or thieves were not merely hiding their loot in private vaults, but actively feeding it into the collector's market. This revelation turned the Springfield case from a local embarrassment into a federal matter. The FBI's art crime specialists, along with postal inspectors who monitored fraudulent interstate sales, were called in to coordinate efforts. Patterns of disappearance. As investigators dug deeper, they noticed telling patterns. The missing maps often came from the same categories: 16th and 17th century nautical charts, decorative maps of the Americas, and city plans from early European atlases. These were not chosen at random, they were the maps most coveted by collectors, the ones most likely to fetch high sums at auction. Moreover, the thefts displayed knowledge. The excisions were clean, executed by someone familiar with the construction of old books. Some maps were removed so precisely that the mutilation went unnoticed until years later. This was no amateur opportunist, it was someone trained, deliberate, and confident. Suspicion began to shift inward. Could the thief be an academic, a scholar with both access and expertise? The academic underworld. The rare map trade in the 1980s was fueled not only by wealthy collectors, but also by academics supplementing their incomes. Dealers whispered about professors who quietly sold duplicates from university collections, or students who turned theft into quick profit. The Springfield theft fit uncomfortably into this shadowy world. Whispers circulated. A graduate student who had spent unusual hours in the rare book room, a visiting researcher who left abruptly after a semester, a collector who seemed suddenly flush with new inventory. None of these suspicions crystallized into evidence, but they revealed a troubling truth: the theft may not have come from outside, but from within the scholarly community itself. Investigators' methods. With little physical evidence to work with, investigators relied on paper trails. They scoured auction catalogs, private dealer inventories, and advertisements in trade journals. Each listing of an early map became a possible lead. Comparisons were painstaking. Marginal notes, stains, or color patterns in the Springfield maps documented in catalog records were matched against items now for sale. In some cases, the match was undeniable. A map that had vanished from the Springfield Library in 1985 appeared in a London dealer's shop 2 years later, priced at several £1,000s. But tracing the chain of custody was another matter. Dealers often refused to reveal their sources, citing client confidentiality. Some genuinely did not know they had purchased from intermediaries, at small fairs or private sales. The maps passed through so many hands that their origins were deliberately obscured. The emotional toll. For librarians, the investigation was deeply personal. They were guardians of collections entrusted not only to their care, but to the public good. To discover that pieces had been stolen under their watch felt like betrayal. Some librarians admitted to sleepless nights, haunted by the idea that their openness had been exploited. One staff member recalled, "We thought of ourselves as caretakers. We believed in access, in letting scholars touch history. To realize that generosity had been used against us, it was devastating." The thefts forced libraries across the country to rethink their philosophy. Rare books that had once been freely available now required strict supervision. Access grew limited. In protecting the collections, openness was sacrificed. A wider conspiracy. As the 1990s began, it became clear that the Springfield theft was not the work of a lone rogue. Too many libraries, too many missing maps, too many similarities in method. Investigators began to suspect a network, a group of thieves, or a single individual striking repeatedly, feeding the same black market pipeline. The Springfield case, in particular, showed signs of planning. The missing maps were the most marketable, excised with surgical skill, and disappeared without witnesses. Whoever committed the theft had both patience and purpose. The growing theory was chilling. This was not random pilfering, but a systematic looting of cultural heritage on a global scale. The net tightens. By the mid-1990s, years of careful investigation into map thefts across North America began to converge. Libraries compared notes, cataloging their losses and sharing suspicious incidents. Dealers, under pressure, provided more transparency. The FBI, Interpol, and even Scotland Yard coordinated across borders, tracing how stolen maps flowed from universities into the hands of collectors. The picture that emerged was disturbing but finally concrete. A single individual was responsible for many of the thefts, including those at Springfield and other institutions. His name was Edward Forbes Smiley III, the man behind the razor blade. Smiley was no common criminal. He was a respected map dealer, well known in scholarly circles. He presented himself as a passionate cartographer, a man devoted to preserving history. He attended conferences, donated to libraries, and built relationships with academics. His reputation gave him access, and his apparent expertise gave him cover. Behind the facade, Smiley had been cutting maps out of rare volumes for years. He knew precisely which atlases contained the most valuable sheets, and he targeted them with surgical efficiency. He carried razor blades, hidden tools, and a practiced manner. When suspicion arose, he moved on to another library, another collection. His scheme was as simple as it was devastating. Steal maps, sell them through legitimate dealers, and profit from the hunger of collectors who rarely asked questions. The moment of capture. Smiley's downfall came not through elaborate surveillance but through a small mistake. In 2005, while consulting rare maps at Yale's Bainick Library, he accidentally dropped a razor blade on the floor. A staff member noticed and reported it. Security was called, and Smiley was detained. When investigators searched his belongings, they discovered stolen maps hidden among his notes. The arrest sent shockwaves through the rare book world. If someone so trusted, so prominent could be a thief, then no library was safe. Linking back to Springfield. In the aftermath, investigators reviewed Smiley's activities across decades. The trail of missing maps from Springfield and other libraries matched his movements almost exactly. Though not every theft could be conclusively tied to him, many maps had already disappeared into private collections. The pattern was undeniable. Smiley eventually confessed to stealing nearly 100 maps from multiple institutions, though experts believe the true number was far higher. Many of Springfield's missing pieces were traced back to him, though not all were ever recovered. The trial and sentencing. In 2006, Smiley pled guilty to multiple counts of theft. At sentencing, he appeared contrite, claiming he had been motivated not only by profit but also by a misguided belief that he was rescuing maps from obscurity. The judge, unmoved, sentenced him to several years in federal prison. For the scholarly community, the damage was already done. Libraries had lost irreplaceable artifacts. Some maps were returned, but many had been sold overseas or to private buyers unwilling to part with their acquisitions. Consequences for libraries. The Smiley affair and the Springfield thefts within it transformed how libraries approached rare collections. Access grew strictly controlled. Reading rooms added cameras, security guards, and detailed check-in, check-out procedures. Some institutions digitized their rare holdings, limiting physical access altogether. While these measures protected collections, they also changed the experience of scholarship. Researchers found it harder to work with original documents. Trust between scholars and librarians, once assumed, was now filtered through layers of suspicion. The market reacts. The rare map trade also changed. Collectors became more cautious, demanding provenance records and scrutinizing dealers. Auction houses tightened their due diligence, fearing association with stolen goods. Yet the hunger for maps never disappeared. As long as historical cartography carried cultural and financial value, the temptation of theft lingered. The enduring mystery. Even after Smiley's conviction, many questions remained unresolved. How many maps had truly been stolen? How many still hung, framed in private homes, their origins forgotten? Could all the missing Springfield pieces ever be traced? Some experts believe that hundreds, perhaps thousands, of stolen maps remain hidden in collections around the world, their owners unaware or willfully ignorant of their tainted history. The Springfield case, in particular, left painful gaps in its archives, gaps that can never be fully repaired. Story 6. The Case of the Vanishing Post Office Safe. A building at the center of town. Every small town in America has a place that serves as its heartbeat. In Millfield, Ohio, during the early 1970s, that place was the post office. The squat brick building, with its modest columns and flagpole out front, was more than just a site for letters and packages. It was where neighbors met, where gossip flowed, and where the daily rhythm of life was measured by the rattle of mail slots and the thump of parcels on the counter. At its center stood a bulky, old-fashioned safe. Painted dull gray and set firmly in a back room, it was meant to symbolize security, an unshakable guardian of money orders, stamps, and the occasional cash deposits the postmaster handled. For decades, no one questioned its reliability. That changed one summer morning in 1972, when the safe and everything inside it vanished without a trace. The morning discovery. It was the assistant postmaster, a man named Carl Jennings, who first noticed. Arriving early, he unlocked the front door and shuffled to the back to prepare the day's paperwork. But when he opened the office where the safe should have stood, he froze. The corner was empty. The heavy steel safe, weighing nearly half a ton, was gone. No broken locks, no splintered doors. Just an empty space where it had once rested, and a faint trail of scuff marks across the wooden floor leading to the rear exit. Carl called the police immediately. Within an hour, the local sheriff, deputies, and a handful of federal postal inspectors crowded into the cramped room, staring at the impossible. How could such a massive object disappear from a locked federal building without anyone noticing? The contents of the safe. The safe had contained more than stamps and paperwork. Inside was nearly $30,000 in postal money orders, several $1,000s in cash from recent transactions, and sensitive records detailing local financial activities. For a town like Millfield, this wasn't just a theft, it was a staggering blow to its sense of order. But perhaps most unsettling was what it implied. Someone had managed to move a safe that should have required at least 4 men and specialized equipment. And yet, no one in the quiet streets around the post office had reported unusual noise or activity that night. Early theories. At first, investigators assumed the theft had been the work of professionals. Safecrackers, they reasoned, might have targeted Millfield, knowing that small-town post offices had fewer security measures than urban banks. But something didn't add up. Professional burglars typically opened safes on-site, using drills or explosives. They rarely risked transporting the whole object. Moving the safe would have been logistically complicated and highly conspicuous. This led to a second, more troubling theory. The theft was an inside job. Only someone familiar with the post office's routines, its alarms, and the layout of the building could have orchestrated such a theft without raising suspicion. The community reacts. For Millfield's residents, the crime quickly became an obsession. In barbershops, diners, and church basements, theories flourished. Some whispered about a band of traveling criminals passing through on the interstate. Others suspected a disgruntled former employee or even one of the current staff. Carl Jennings, the assistant postmaster who found the empty corner, came under scrutiny. He swore his innocence, but neighbors eyed him with suspicion. The postmaster himself, A man nearing retirement grew withdrawn, shaken by the idea that his office had been violated. The once trusting community began to turn inward, suspicion seeping into conversations that had once been easy and friendly. Investigators' frustrations. The investigation stretched on for weeks, then months. Detectives interviewed staff, examined financial records, and even scoured pawn shops and trucking companies for signs of the missing safe. But leads dried up quickly. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no sign of forced entry. Whoever had stolen the safe had done so with uncanny precision. It was as though the safe had simply vanished into thin air. A town haunted by a mystery. As autumn came, Millfield tried to resume its normal rhythm. The post office replaced its missing safe with a new model, bolted firmly into the floor. But the ghost of the theft lingered. People glanced suspiciously at delivery trucks. Conversations trailed off when postal employees entered the room. The empty corner in the back office was patched, painted over, and forgotten in official records. Yet for the townspeople, it remained a silent reminder that something extraordinary had happened in their ordinary little building. A federal spotlight. The theft of a safe from a federal building was no small matter. Within days of the discovery, U.S. postal inspectors arrived in Millfield. Unlike the small-town sheriff's office, the inspectors had the weight of federal authority and decades of experience investigating mail fraud, theft, and internal corruption. Their arrival sent ripples through the town. Suddenly, Millfield wasn't just dealing with a local crime, it was on the radar of Washington. Inspectors began with exhaustive interviews. Every postal employee was questioned, from clerks who sorted letters to janitors who swept floors at night. Background checks were conducted, financial records scrutinized. If an inside job was suspected, the investigators would leave no stone unturned. Suspicion in the ranks. Attention quickly focused on two employees. First was Carl Jennings, the assistant postmaster who had discovered the theft. His proximity to the crime scene made him an obvious suspect. Investigators pressed him about his personal finances, his relationships, and even the timing of his arrival on the morning of the crime. Carl, known for his steady manner, grew visibly frayed under the scrutiny. His alibi being at home with his wife was credible but not ironclad. The second was a part-time postal worker named Roger Lane, a man in his 20s with a reputation for drinking and occasional brushes with the law. Though Roger had no direct access to the safe, investigators learned he had boasted about easy money in the post office at a local bar weeks before the theft. But neither lead produced solid evidence. Carl's finances showed no sudden windfall, and Roger's claims turned out to be drunken rambling, not concrete knowledge. Both men were left in an uneasy limbo, neither cleared nor charged. Mechanical clues. The most perplexing element remained the mechanics of the crime. How had the thieves moved a half-ton safe without anyone noticing? Investigators consulted experts in rigging and safe moving. They concluded the job likely required a dolly, straps, and possibly a small truck with a hydraulic lift. Yet no one in the surrounding neighborhood recalled hearing the rumble of metal or the crash of equipment during the night. Postal inspectors speculated that the thieves may have disguised themselves as contractors or movers, slipping in during the evening hours when lights in the building were expected to be off. In a small town, where people assumed they knew every truck and face, such a disguise might have been startlingly effective. A lead on the highway. Weeks into the investigation, a tip came from a truck stop 30 miles away. A waitress remembered two men hauling a large, tarp-covered object in the back of a pickup truck around on the day after the theft. They had paid in cash, ordered breakfast, and left quickly. The description was vague: one tall, one shorter, both wearing work clothes. Inspectors followed the lead, tracing gas stations and diners along the interstate, but the trail soon vanished. Without license plate numbers or clearer details, The sighting became just another tantalizing clue that failed to resolve the mystery. Community division. Meanwhile, Millfield simmered. Theories multiplied, and gossip spread faster than the mail itself. Some residents believed the safe had been moved with the help of corrupt postal workers. Others whispered about an organized crime syndicate testing small-town vulnerabilities before targeting larger institutions. Families who had once trusted each other grew divided. A neighbor's new car or sudden home renovation could spark hushed suspicions. At church services, glances lingered, conversations faltered. The safe had been stolen, but what truly unsettled Millfield was the theft of certainty. The case grows cold. By the winter of 1972, momentum had slowed. Without physical evidence or credible suspects, federal inspectors scaled back their presence. The sheriff's office, overwhelmed by a case that seemed to defy local resources, could only keep files open and hope for a break. The safe itself was never found. Some theorized it had been cracked open in an isolated barn and dumped in a river. Others believed it had been hidden in plain sight, perhaps buried or dismantled. But despite searches of nearby fields, streams, and abandoned properties, no trace ever surfaced. Lingering doubts. Carl Jennings never escaped suspicion. Though officially cleared, whispers followed him for years. Each time he walked down Millfield's Main Street, he felt eyes on his back. For Roger Lane, the barroom braggart, the incident became a stain on his reputation, one he wore reluctantly until he eventually left town. Even the postmaster himself, who retired shortly after the incident, confessed to friends that he felt complicit, though he had done nothing wrong because the theft had happened under his watch. A crime that refused to die. Years passed, and the theft of the Millfield safe stubbornly remained unsolved. Unlike crimes that fade quietly into the background of small-town memory, this one lingered. Each anniversary of the theft, local newspapers ran a short piece revisiting the details. Children who hadn't even been born in 1972 grew up hearing the story retold by their parents and grandparents. The legend grew with each retelling. Some versions insisted the safe was buried under a barn foundation. Others claimed it was dragged to the banks of the Ohio River and rolled into the current. A few even whispered that the money had been funneled into local businesses, meaning the fruits of the theft still circulated quietly through Millfield's economy. For a crime that had left no suspects behind, its impact was strangely eternal. Attempts to reopen the case. In the late 1980s, a new sheriff reopened the cold case files. Advances in forensics and investigative procedure, he believed, might offer new insights. His team re-interviewed surviving witnesses, tracked down long-retired postal inspectors, and scoured old photographs of the post office for overlooked details. But again, no progress came. Evidence had degraded, memories had blurred, and potential suspects had either died or scattered far from Ohio. The case returned to its cabinet drawer, one of many unsolved mysteries that defied resolution. Federal reflections. For the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the theft of Millfield's safe became an odd case study. It was cited in training manuals not for its violence or complexity, but for its audacity. The theft highlighted vulnerabilities in small-town post offices, insufficient alarm systems, reliance on trust rather than physical safeguards, and the assumption that such crimes wouldn't happen here. In later decades, when federal buildings and banks hardened their security with cameras, reinforced safes, and electronic alarms, the Millfield theft was occasionally remembered as one of the quiet cautionary tales that spurred change. Community memory. By the 1990s, the theft had become part of Millfield's identity. Local storytellers added embellishments, claims of inside conspiracies, or sightings of mysterious trucks that never appeared in official reports. At school fairs and community gatherings, the vanishing safe was told with the same rhythm as ghost stories, a mixture of fact and invention. For older residents who remembered the day the safe disappeared, the story wasn't folklore but a wound that never fully closed. They recalled the way suspicion had poisoned the town, how neighbors turned cold toward one another, and how a simple act of theft had fractured trust in a community that once prided itself on knowing everyone. Personal legacies. For Carl Jennings, the assistant postmaster, the shadow never lifted. Though never charged, he lived the rest of his life under a cloud of doubt. Friends described him as more withdrawn in his later years, carrying the weight of suspicion as though it had been bolted to his shoulders just as firmly as the safe once was to the floor. Roger Lane, the young part-timer with a big mouth, drifted from job to job before leaving Ohio altogether. Years later, when news reached Millfield that he had died in another state, some locals nodded knowingly as if his fate confirmed suspicions that had followed him since 1972. Others simply shrugged, remembering him as a troubled youth who had been caught in the orbit of a crime he might not have committed. The strange appeal of the unsolved. Why did the story of a missing safe matter so much? It wasn't the largest theft in American history. No one was killed, no mobsters were unmasked, and no nationwide manhunt unfolded. Yet for Millfield, the ordinary nature of the crime was exactly what made it so unsettling. A crime committed in broad daylight, in a city bank with television cameras watching, might shock the public but eventually fade. But a crime that unfolded quietly, invisibly, in a place everyone trusted that stuck like a burr in the town's collective memory. Each unanswered question was an itch that could never be scratched. Who had the strength, the audacity, the cleverness to steal something so immovable? And why had no trace ever been found? Reflection, a theft larger than itself. In the end, the disappearance of Millfield's post office safe became more than a crime. It was a story about vulnerability, how even the most ordinary places and the most ordinary people can be touched by extraordinary deception. The safe was gone, the money scattered, and the culprits, whether outsiders or insiders, remained nameless. But the real theft, perhaps, was of certainty itself. Millfield learned that not every crime ends with handcuffs and courtroom drama. Some end with silence, an empty corner in a room, and decades of speculation. And so, the case of the vanishing safe slipped permanently into the category of small-town legend. Unresolved, unforgettable, and still echoing with the same question that haunted Millfield in 1972. If a safe could vanish without a sound, what else might be possible in the quiet hours of the night? Story 7. The Forged Hymns of Cedar Grove. A quiet town, a trusted man. In the late 1960s, Cedar Grove, Indiana, was much like countless small Midwestern towns. Quiet streets lined with maples, a single main road dotted with hardware stores and diners, and a church steeple that rose above it all. For the people of Cedar Grove, the church wasn't just a place of worship. It was the axis of community life. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, and annual picnics all revolved around it. At the center of that church was a man named Harold Hal Whittaker. In his mid-50s, Hal had the face of a kindly uncle, round glasses, neatly combed gray hair, and a warm smile that reassured parishioners he was someone who could be trusted. And indeed, Hal had been trusted for decades. He was not only the church treasurer but also a respected bookkeeper who occasionally managed accounts for local businesses. To most, Hal was the embodiment of honesty. To a few, he was something else entirely. The first signs of trouble. The trouble began quietly, as these things often do. A missing check here, a late deposit there, small discrepancies that could be easily explained away. The pastor, Reverend Morton, noticed the first irregularity in 1968 when a donation made by a local family never appeared in the church ledger. When he asked Hal about it, Hal gave a simple explanation: a clerical error. "I'll straighten it out," he said with his usual calm smile. And he did, at least on paper. The books balanced again, the missing funds accounted for. For a while, that explanation was enough. But in a place like Cedar Grove, where trust ran deeper than suspicion, subtle doubts often took years to surface. A pattern emerges. By 1970, the church had embarked on a fundraising drive to renovate its aging building. Parishioners gave generously, donating money they could barely afford to spare. Some sold heirlooms or dipped into savings, motivated by a sense of duty to preserve the church for future generations. And yet, as months passed, construction lagged. Contractors complained about late payments. Supplies weren't arriving on time. Reverend Morton, puzzled, went back to the ledgers. Once again, everything appeared correct on the surface. Donations in, expenses out. The books balanced. But beneath the tidy columns of ink, something was wrong. The quiet skill of forgery. It was only later that investigators would discover Hal's true skill, forgery. With meticulous precision, he was able to copy signatures, falsify receipts, and create a paper trail that looked as solid as stone. For every missing check, there was a forged deposit slip. For every vanished dollar, an invented invoice explained it away. Hal's background as a bookkeeper had given him all the tools he needed. He knew how audits worked, how inspectors thought, and perhaps most importantly, how to maintain an appearance of calm reliability. In Cedar Grove, where financial oversight was minimal and suspicion nearly unthinkable, his forgeries went undetected for years. A rumor in the choir. What ultimately cracked the facade wasn't a ledger, but a whisper. One evening in 1971, during choir practice, a member mentioned in passing that her donation to the building fund had never been acknowledged in the church bulletin. Another woman quickly agreed, saying the same thing had happened to her. At first, it was brushed off as a clerical mix-up, but as more voices joined in, the coincidences piled up. Reverend Morton, now uneasy, began making quiet inquiries. He contacted families directly, asking whether their donations had been recorded. One after another, he heard the same refrain. They had given, but their gifts had disappeared into silence. The weight of doubt was finally too heavy to ignore. The pastor's dilemma. For Reverend Morton, confronting Hal was almost unthinkable. This was a man who had held the church's trust for decades, who had overseen baptisms, funerals, and weddings without a hint of impropriety. To accuse him of theft seemed almost like accusing a family member. Yet the numbers and the whispers could no longer be dismissed. In early 1972, Morton quietly asked a trusted parishioner with accounting experience to review the books. Within days, the discrepancies began to multiply. Checks that didn't exist, invoices for work that had never been done, receipts with signatures that seemed off. It was then that Morton realized the unthinkable might be true. The treasurer of Cedar Grove's church, the man who had been trusted more than anyone, might be a thief. A congregation in shock. When the first suspicions about Hal Whitaker surfaced, they spread through Cedar Grove like smoke in a closed room. People tried not to believe it. This was Hal, the treasurer, the trusted neighbor, the man who had balanced their church's finances for 20 years. But as word trickled through the congregation, disbelief gave way to anger. Some parishioners defended him, insisting it was a misunderstanding. Others muttered that they had always wondered about his quiet confidence and his habit of locking the church office door when working late. For Reverend Morton, the dilemma was agonizing. He had to protect the church and its donors, but exposing the truth risked dividing the town beyond repair. The audit. The parishioner brought in to help an accountant named George Ralston spent nights at the church going through old ledgers. He compared donation records with bank statements, invoices with receipts, and even tracked checks that had supposedly been deposited. The deeper he dug, the worse it became. Dozens of donations had never made it into the church's accounts. Instead, they had vanished into Hal's forged paperwork. Deposit slips with his handwriting, receipts bearing fake contractor names, checks, endorsed, with signatures that parishioners swore were not their own. Ralston's final report was damning. Thousands of dollars, enough to complete the entire church renovation, had simply disappeared. The confrontation. In the spring of 1972, Reverend Morton and a small committee met with Hal in the church office. The evidence was laid out on the table: copies of forged receipts, mismatched signatures, bank statements that contradicted the church's books. For a long time, Hal sat silently, adjusting his glasses, staring at the papers as though they were in a foreign language. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost detached. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I've kept these books honestly all my life." But the papers told another story. When pressed, Hal's explanations grew thinner. At one point he blamed the bank, at another he suggested the pastor's secretary had mishandled funds. The committee listened patiently, but it was clear: the trust that had held for decades was gone. Turning to the law, Morton's next decision was the hardest of his career. He contacted law enforcement. The Indiana State Police, working with federal postal inspectors, launched a quiet investigation. Church funds had often been handled through money orders and checks routed through the postal system, bringing federal jurisdiction into play. Agents interviewed parishioners, collected original documents, and scrutinized Hal's bookkeeping. What emerged was a pattern not of negligence, but of deliberate fraud. Hal had siphoned church funds into his personal accounts using forged endorsements, then covered his tracks with fabricated paperwork. The scale was staggering for a town the size of Cedar Grove. Over nearly a decade, Hal had embezzled an estimated $40,000, the equivalent of more than $250,000 today. Motive or mystery? Why had Hal done it? That question puzzled both investigators and townspeople. He wasn't flashy. He didn't own a new car or a bigger house than anyone else. His clothes were neat but modest. His vacations, when taken, were small fishing trips to local lakes. Some suggested gambling debts. Others whispered about a mistress in a nearby city. Still others believed he had quietly invested the money somewhere, hiding wealth behind a veil of ordinariness. But the truth never fully emerged. When asked directly by investigators, Hal denied taking a dime. The forgeries, he insisted, were not his. The evidence said otherwise. A town divided. The fallout split Cedar Grove. Some members of the congregation demanded Hal's immediate arrest and public disgrace. Others begged for leniency, pointing to his years of service and his failing health. The church itself nearly fractured under the weight of anger. Families stopped attending, unsure if their donations had lined Hal's pockets. The building renovation was halted indefinitely, the partially repaired roof covered with a patchwork of tarps. For Reverend Morton, each Sunday sermon felt like standing on a fault line. The arrest. By late 1972, state police had enough evidence to act. One October morning, Hal was quietly arrested at his home. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as officers escorted the bespectacled treasurer into a squad car. The charge: embezzlement and forgery on a federal scale. When news broke, it hit Cedar Grove like a thunderclap. The man everyone had trusted most had betrayed that trust in the most intimate way by stealing not just money, but faith itself. Preparing for trial. In early 1973, Harold Hal Whitaker stood accused in federal court. The charges included multiple counts of mail fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The federal angle gave the case weight, as many of the forged checks and money orders had passed through the postal system, making his crimes more than just a matter of local betrayal. They were federal offenses. The courtroom was packed each day with Cedar Grove residents. Some came out of anger, determined to see justice done. Others came out of loyalty, hoping to catch some sign that Hal had been misunderstood, that there was still a shred of innocence left to cling to. But as the prosecution laid out its case, that hope grew harder to maintain. The evidence. The evidence was exhaustive. Experts testified that dozens of signatures had been forged in Hal's distinctive handwriting. Bank employees described how he had personally cashed money orders that were supposed to be deposited into the church's account. Contractors denied issuing invoices that Hal had presented as proof of payment. A forensic accountant walked the jury through years of records, pointing out the false trails and fabricated paperwork. Each revelation chipped away at Hal's defense. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who, while modest in appearance, had methodically siphoned away the lifeblood of his church. They emphasized not just the money stolen, but the breach of faith, the betrayal of a congregation's trust. Hal's defense. Hal took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that underscored his stubborn refusal to admit guilt. "I never stole from my church," he told the jury, adjusting his glasses with trembling hands. He blamed clerical mistakes, bank errors, and even hinted that others might have been responsible. But when pressed about the forged signatures, some of which matched samples of his own writing, his explanations faltered. Jurors watched as he struggled under cross-examination, his once calm demeanor unraveling. The image of the steady, trustworthy treasurer dissolved in real time. The verdict. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty on multiple counts. The verdict stunned some, satisfied others. For many in Cedar Grove, it was the confirmation of what they had feared but resisted believing. Their treasurer had stolen from them, lied to them, and broken their trust. Hal was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He was ordered to repay the stolen funds, though few believed restitution would ever come. Community fallout. The trial left Cedar Grove scarred. Attendance at church services dropped sharply in the months following the verdict. Many families withheld donations, fearful that another betrayal might occur. The renovation project was abandoned altogether. The patched roof eventually collapsed in a storm, forcing the church to hold services in the basement until a modest rebuild years later. Reverend Morton never truly recovered from the ordeal. He remained pastor for several more years but carried a visible weariness, as though the betrayal had hollowed out something inside him. Parishioners recalled how his sermons shifted after the trial, less about hope and joy, more about vigilance and the dangers of misplaced trust. Hal's final years. Hal served 3 years before being released on parole for good behavior. He returned quietly to Cedar Grove but found no welcome waiting. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Local businesses refused to hire him. His once solid reputation had turned to ash. He lived out his remaining years in relative isolation, a figure of quiet disgrace in a town that never forgot what he had done. When he died in the early 1980s, only a handful of people attended his funeral. The lessons left behind. The story of Hal Whitaker left a lasting mark on Cedar Grove and on countless small churches across the Midwest. Congregations began adopting stricter financial oversight practices, requiring multiple signatures on checks, implementing regular independent audits, and ensuring no single person controlled all the books. The scandal reminded communities that trust, while precious, must be guarded with transparency. Even in the most ordinary of settings, with the most ordinary of people, betrayal could lurk behind a calm smile.